Good morning, Citizen Peterson. First, I have a bunch of questions and I want to have them answered immediately. Like, you have a post on Quora in which you encourage all children to incur skateboarding injuries. but also stated in this post, you wrote that do not try to rescue someone who does not want to be rescued, and be very careful about rescuing someone who does. And can you reconcile this with what you stated about transcendent morality and the heroic impulse that I guess men are supposed to be born with?
Okay. So, well, the skateboarding question is, I have a book coming out in 2018 called 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. And one of the chapters in there is from that Quora posting, and it's called Don't Bother Children When They're Skateboarding. And it's sort of associated with what I had said earlier about parkour, for example, is that, kids need to go out and push themselves against danger, because that's what life is pushing yourself against danger. And when you see kids doing things that are dangerous but spectacular, then you kind of have a moral obligation to back the hell off and let them experiment with their own mortality, because you can't keep them safe. The best thing you can do is make them able and courageous. And I would say that that's a more difficult lesson, generally speaking, for mothers to learn than for fathers to learn, and that was Freud's fundamental observation, but it's absolutely crucial. And so I've seen kids do, you can obviously be a fool on a skateboard, although the distinction between being a fool and developing yourself is not as clear as people might like to imagine. And when kids are out there with no helmet and doing dangerous things, it's like there's a part of me that of course is very worried about it, but there's another part of me that admires it very much, because they're practicing what they need to practice in order to cope with the world. Okay, so there's that. Now, the other one was rescuing people. Yeah. Well, I got this partly from Carl Rogers, because Rogers he's a clinician, a very famous clinician, and he was a Christian missionary to begin with, but he didn't end up that way. But he was very interested in the utility of listening as a means of redemption, essentially. And listening, by the way, is if you have someone that you know that has a problem, the best thing you can often do is listen to them, if they're actually trying to communicate, because people configure themselves through speech. And most people can't think, and I don't mean that in a mean way. I mean the way they think is by talking, and they can't talk unless they have someone to talk to. And it's partly because they're bouncing the idea off them and seeing if it makes sense and seeing how the person responds. So listening is a great thing. But Rogers was also interested in the preconditions for having a redemptive relationship, and that could be a therapeutic relationship or an intimate relationship. And one of the things he claimed was that unless the person was aiming upward, there was nothing you could do about it. And that seemed to be associated with this idea of that initial choice, say, between good and evil. See, once someone comes to therapy, they've already done something. They've already said, I have a problem, conceivably I could fix it, and I need to do something about it. And then so half the work is already done by the time they show up, because they've already said, well, things aren't as good as they could be and I could do something about it. The question is, can you do anything about someone who isn't at that state? And my observation, and this is Roger's observation as well, is that you can't. I think you can serve by example, but until the person has decided on their own that they're wrong, and that's why they're suffering, that there's something wrong about what they're doing, and that they want to fix it. I think that even trying to hammer against that often makes it worse. So, and I know that Solzhenitsyn, when he was talking about the communist ideologues, the really hardcore communist ideologues that were eaten up by the Gulag Archipelago system, sort of devoured by their own, he saw the same thing, was that until they were willing to admit that something was wrong with the manner in which they had construed the world, that it had resulted in their own demise, that there was actually no way of communicating with them. They're in kind of an authoritarian bubble. And so I don't think that...
So even if you orient yourself as an archetypal hero, there's no way you can get through that barrier that
Well, I think that that's part of the issue of free will. I do not think that people can learn unless they admit that they're wrong. There's this play, The Cocktail Hour by T.S. Eliot, and he has this woman in the play, and she comes up to a psychiatrist and she says, just in the course of casual conversation, she says, I really hope there's something wrong with me. And of course the psychiatrist is a bit taken aback by that, and he says, well, why in the world would you hope such a thing? And she says something like, Well, like I'm suffering, man. Things are not good for me. I'm having a dreadful time of it. And as far as I can tell, there's only two possibilities. Either the world, in its essence, is conspiring against me and I'm doomed because what am I going to do about the world? Like it's just built into the structure of reality. Or I'm doing something wrong. So I'm really hoping that I'm doing something wrong because if I am, then maybe I could fix it and I'd stop suffering. And it's something like that. And see, it's also, I think that if your life isn't what it could be and you're suffering, then it seems to me that that should be sufficient evidence that you don't know enough. And if that isn't sufficient evidence that you don't know enough, then I don't know how anyone else could provide you with that evidence. And so I'm going to leave it at that.
This is psychological rescue, not like rescuing someone who's drowning, for example?
Yes, you can rescue people when they're drowning even if they don't want you to.
Perfect.
I'll tell you something about that though. Something interesting about that, and that's relevant, is that, I don't know how many of you know how you rescue someone who's drowning. You do it like this, right? You come to them like this, and you push them away with your foot. I'm telling you, that's what you do if you're a lifeguard, because if they're panicking and they grab you, you both drown. And that's stupid, because then you both drown, right? And that's a really good way, that's a really good metaphor for trying to help someone too. It's like when people are in real trouble, some of it's they're confused and some of it is that their life has collapsed around them and there's some malevolence there and there's some desire for vengeance. It's just like one dangerous mess. And if you're going to wade in there unprepared, the probability that they're going to take you down compared to you elevating them is very, very high. Because you don't even know what your damn psychological stability rests on. You might be saying just because you're lucky and surrounded by sane people, that doesn't mean that you have the psychological wherewithal to really pull someone up from the depths of the underworld, especially if they've also got one foot in hell. So you should bloody well be careful about doing that kind of thing. It's hubristic to attempt it, and I would definitely caution people very carefully about trying to rescue someone who doesn't want to be rescued. It's very dangerous activity, and it can easily be counterproductive. Okay, so this is it. One more question, and then
I'll make it quick.
Okay.
Hi, Dr. Peterson. My question is, I know you stated in the last lecture that the importance for setting aims in life and to kind of have goals to work towards, right? So my question was, how do you do that if you don't know where you want to go? Because that's kind of where I got stuck on your future authoring program.
Okay, that's a good question. That's a really good question. I think it's echoed to some degree in the structure of the biblical stories, and in this manner. So there's this notion in the Old Testament that morality is following a sequence of prohibitions. There's a bunch of bad things you shouldn't do, and then basically you're good enough. And I think there's wisdom in that. I think that's kind of where children start, right? I mean, I love children and all that, but they're crazy little creatures and they need to be, civilized. And partly what you do is you lay prohibitions on them, and mostly what you're trying to do is lay prohibitions on them for the behaviors that if they manifested would make their life miserable. So I have another chapter in this book that I'm writing called Don't Let Your Children Do Anything That Makes You Dislike Them. And the idea there is that your job as a parent is to help your children become the sort of 4-year-olds that adults genuinely smile at when they come into a room, because that makes the entire social environment both truthful and welcoming. And so your job is to make them desirable social beings, and a lot of that is prohibition. Okay, and there's this ethical transformation. It happens to some degree in the tradition of in the prophetic tradition, where there's a spirit that seemed in some sense to rise above the law, but there's a real transformation between the Old Testament and the New Testament, because the Old Testament is prohibition and the New Testament is, well, here's the good things you do once you're more than merely prohibiting yourself from impulsive sin, let's say. There's a positive good to be accomplished. Well, you might say, well, I don't know what the positive good is. Fair enough, man. So this is why this thing that I've said to people has become this crazy internet meme, but that's to clean up your room, and which is a lot better and more useful than people think. It's a lot harder too, but the first thing you do, I think, and I learned this in part from Solzhenitsyn when he was trying to iron out his soul when he was in the Gulag, because he was trying to figure out how he got there. how he contributed to how he got there. You know, not Stalin and Hitler, even though they were kind of to blame, you know, but there wasn't much he could do about that. I think what you have to do, and this is part of humility, is you have to look around you within your sphere of influence, like the direct sphere of influence, and fix the things that announce themselves as in need of repair. And those are often small things, you know, and they can be like your room. Put it in order, because the thing is, it isn't exactly so important that your room is in order, although it is. What's important is that you learn how to distinguish between chaos and order, and to be able to act in a manner that produces order. And in most households, there's 100 things that could be done to just make it less hideous and horrible. And so practicing that it's a real useful form of meditation, and it's also, I think it's a divine act, because you're taking chaos. And you know, if you pay attention even to a room, it's so interesting, and I learned, because I've renovated many places now and tried to make them beautiful, and one of the things that I've really learned is that even if you own a structure, unless you've investigated all the nooks and crannies and cleaned them up and put your own imprint on them and made them yours, they're not yours. The mere fact of physical ownership doesn't make them yours. You have to establish a dynamic relationship with the objects before they're actually yours. And I think you can do something as simple as just sit on your bed and think, okay, there's probably like 5 things I could do today so that tomorrow morning is slightly better than this morning was, or at least I'm not falling behind. And those will usually be, it's like having to eat a toad in the morning, right? It's like, it's not going to be something you want to do. There'll be things you're trying to avoid. They're snakes, essentially. But if you ask yourself, like you're asking someone, which I think is a form of prayer, if you ask yourself, instead of telling yourself, you know, what is it that I could do to set things more right today, that I would actually do? It's usually some small thing, because you're not that disciplined, you know. Then you can go do it. And then you put the world together a little more when you do that. And that spreads out. But you also construct yourself into something that's better able to call order forth from chaos. And that makes you just incrementally stronger. And then the next day, you can maybe take on a slightly larger task. And like, you get the benefit of compound interest if you do that. It's a tremendously powerful technique. And I think if you do that, at some point, instead of just having to fix things up that are not good, you'll start to get a glimmer of the positive things that you could do, you know, the positive things that you could do that would actually constitute a vision. And that's what I would recommend.